Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Pricing Matters. This is the second in a series of discussions we planned for 2020 around various topics that we think are under-discussed in pricing and how it's changing with technology. This time, we're going to focus on the dark side of pricing, unethical and illegal pricing practices, examples of how it can happen, and some guidelines on how to avoid it. I'm again joined by my regular guest, Dr. Ian Tidswell. Hi, Ian.
Hey, Gabe. Thanks for having me again. It's great to be back. Another interesting topic that I think is really complementary to what we did last time. For those who maybe didn't join us last time, we talked about mission-driven pricing. So some of the considerations by organizations that are mission-driven, or in all or in part. And despite some complications around identifying when a company actually is a mission-driven company, because lots of companies like to say they are, when in fact it's just a marketing spiel. A few things seem to make sense. So one of them is mission-driven organizations don't care as much about profits as profit-driven organizations. Maybe that's redundant, but they're basically willing to accept no profit or lower profits in order to fulfill their mission. And it's not just the marketing fluff. A second thing that I guess I took out of this was to make it work, it's important to be very clear about what the mission is and have some metrics around it. And then there's going to be some need to think about things a little differently because of that. The whole pricing infrastructure we have is around maximizing profit, and this is much more around maximizing something else, i.e. the mission.
Yep. And then there's some different tools and techniques that you would use in that setting, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We didn't really get into that, but there are, I think, a different set of things you would do.
Yep. And we'd be happy to talk more with anyone that's interested about that in more depth. It's a little bit hard to do in a podcast setting to talk about some of those tools. One thing that I also wanted to note for this one is that we will be we're doing this simultaneously as a podcast and webcast, so we will be referring to some URLs and some screenshots throughout. We'll do our best to explain them for those folks following on the podcast, but did want to make it clear up front that was going to be the case here.
Yeah, and those links are available, or be available in the meeting notes, so you can get access to them.
That's right.
I certainly know it was interesting dredging through the web and finding stuff, and then obviously we're not showing you the stuff, the dead ends. We're showing you the interesting stuff. So
right.
Maybe it's interesting for you too. Yeah. Maybe you're pricing geeks as well.
Yep. So for those following on the webcast and to describe for those on the podcast, we showed last time and we're showing now the pricing and technology ethics continuum, right? And so this is just something we came up with to help us talk about the different areas of pricing and technology usage, going from illegal and unethical to questionable and emerging to accepted, then mainstream, and then mission-driven. So last time we really started off on the mission-driven end of the spectrum, and we talked a lot about that. We're not going to really cover that again here, but just to recap, mission-driven organizations are trying to do some good, but many of them aren't, many companies are not very mission-driven, right? They may have a mission, but they're not, the way that we're defining mission-driven wouldn't really fit that, that mold of giving some or all of their profit away in order to further their mission, right? So, most companies are focused on profit generation and profit maximization for their shareholders, right, and their stakeholders. And the difference with some mission-driven or sustainable companies is a focus on a broader set of stakeholders and a mission that's, beyond that. But when you're more focused on profit, you can tend to try out things that may be in this questionable or emerging area, or even, some companies are going into the unethical and illegal. And that's what we wanted to talk about today, right?
Yeah, and I think we're going to start off with trying to figure out what is unethical pricing. I think what is illegal is not always clear, and what is unethical is also not clear. But I think we'll shed a little light on that, right? To my mind, ethical pricing is about, use technical terms, is about not being a jerk.
Yeah.
Maybe that's too simplistic.
It's kind of you could use the golden rule, right? Like that's one of the things that I always feel like if I could teach my kids just that one thing, right? If they can be confident and they understand the golden rule, then I've done a good job as a parent. And it's kind of the same in business, right?
would I be perceived as a jerk if I do this?
Right.
That's sort of the
Right.
question. So the key with avoiding unethical pricing or only doing ethical pricing is to think about the potential negative aspects of what you're doing, of the impact of what you're doing.
Right.
And it might be that and what part of the challenge is what something that might make sense in a broader spectrum maybe doesn't make sense when it to one set of society. We had a thing last time about toll
Winners and
charges.
losers. Yeah, and the winners and losers debate. You have to think about, not only the good of society as a whole, if it really takes advantage or it's at the expense of a lesser advantaged group or any group really, and it really hits them and they don't have a viable alternative, then that's where you get into trouble, right?
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree.
Yeah, so why don't we, I think in this one, what we want to do is have a little bit of structure around how we talk about unethical pricing and really identify some of the boundaries and the different types of unethical and illegal pricing. I think, we wanted to kind of walk through it in a more structured format than we did last time. So does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. It does. So as we were preparing for this, I think there's basically 5 different types of unethical pricing. And we'll go through these. So I'll just list them off and then we can start with the first one. So the first one is price fixing. Then there's anti-competitive pricing, monopoly pricing, price discrimination, and pricing disinformation or price disinformation. So we'll go through those in order. The first one, price fixing. I think this, in many ways, or at least half of this, is the clearest case, the easiest to understand. This is when 2 or more companies who are normally competing for the same business get together and agree on prices. Examples have covered vitamins, sorbates, citric acid, memory chips. Companies do this because you can make a ton of money by doing this. You can really, really capture huge amounts of extra profit surplus this way. The flip side is they always seem to get caught, and then the fines are even bigger. The fines are just enormous around this stuff. For those on the webcast, there's a page up now from for dram prices that was just a couple of years ago. These three leading producers have 95%, 98% of the market, it says here. So the 3 of them get together, and because of that, they were able to make huge amounts of profit, and they got huge fines thrown at them.
Right.
And I think what's clear is this really is a problem in commodity markets. That's when they most incentive to do it, because you've got no price control, and you can get away with it because they can't get away with it, but it's most clear because it's very apples to apples comparisons.
Right, and it basically allows a cartel or a collection of companies to act as a monopoly and exercise the pricing power that a monopoly would have, and that's obviously the problem with it, right? So it's not hard to see how that's unethical. It's basically doing an end around the free market, right? However, there are examples where the government does it, like OPEC, where it is legal, and they have formed cartels and done the same exact thing. Although OPEC's struggling a bit of late, and that's probably an interesting example here, right? Yeah, so we've got this recent, where they made some missteps here, but overall, OPEC took control of oil pricing in the 70s. But now, actually, with the reemergence of U.S. as one of the top oil producers, it's introduced some of these market dynamics, and they're kind of struggling to deal with that, because what can happen is, as they increase prices, then the U.S. or other top producers that are outside of OPEC can actually increase production, which can weaken their hold. So it's basically an example where you can see an outside market influence on a cartel that's trying to act as a monopoly, and therefore losing control of pricing and losing some of that pricing power.
Yeah, that's right. And what's happened in the oil industry is that so OPEC doesn't have as much a share of the market as they used to have, and so they have less control. It's quite.
Yeah. So it's legal when governments do it. It's illegal when companies do it behind closed doors. It is legal to signal pricing, right? So as a market leader, you can say, hey, I'm going to increase pricing by 5% next year, and then kind of see what happens with, the competition. It's not okay to get in a room and decide, okay, we're all going to raise prices by 5% next year, right?
That's right. That's right. So people think it's strange when airlines all have exactly the same prices and one announces a fare increase and then the other ones see if they'll follow. They follow. But that's not. That hasn't been deemed illegal. And I guess I don't think of it as that unethical, right? Because it's such a commodity market. If you don't stick to the same price as everybody else, you lose all your business. So
Right, and there's no way to control that because it's all transparent. You can go on any website and see it, right? So, any travel website. So,
yeah.
yeah,
And so that I think that one's pretty clear: unethical, illegal, done. What is more unclear is this notion of vertical price fixing. So we were just talking about horizontal price fixing. This is on the web. It's the Encyclopedia Britannica has a nice page on this.
how very British
Vertical.
of you.
I think Encyclopedia Britannica is American these days, but anyway,
Is
there you
it?
go. I think so. I think it's been for some time.
Ah.
But anyway, yeah. So vertical price fixing. This is when basically a supplier requires their channel partners to fix the price and only sell at one price. So one can see how you can see how the suppliers would want this. I think it's trickier for the authorities to prosecute, but yes, it can definitely be a way to control pricing.
Right, and it's obvious why companies do this, because to make more money, and governments try to stop it because it hinders competition and harms consumers, which is generally where they start to step in, right?
Right. And a lot of the time, I think it's funny actually in a way, because we try to help our clients manage their channel conflict, or at least I do some of the time, right, by making sure that the price differences between channels make sense.
Yeah, and we do too. I mean, on the kind of technology side, to make sure that you have an omni-channel pricing structure that's unified, and that it does make sense and it's rational, so you don't get a call. I was doing a pricing project one time for a technology company that'll remain nameless, but the CEO and founder of this company got a call from their largest client saying, "Hey, I just saw the price of a product that's lower than our contracted price, and we're supposed to be the lowest priced customer. What's going on?" And that actually is what kicked off the entire project, to get a better hold on all these different groups because they had different groups that were controlling the digital commerce side versus the contract side, and they weren't, referring to each other, and they didn't have a technology platform that could rationalize that, right?
Yeah, my very first project in the pricing technology space was for a company that had realized they needed to do something because they were being sued by their suppliers about their price discrimination, which is coming a bit later in the talk. But basically, they didn't have control over it. So this is a case where you can break the law by accident if you just don't have a very well controlled process.
Yeah. I also was involved in a pricing project where they dealt a lot with government entities, and they had specific contractual obligations around pricing and monitoring pricing that they weren't able to meet, and got themselves into trouble, and that kicked off the whole project as well. But let's get back to this idea of vertical price fixing. So, short of requiring a price, suppliers can influence channel partners, right? So you can't, as a manufacturer or supplier, say you have to charge this price, but there are mechanisms that these suppliers use in order to control the pricing, right? So there's this idea of minimum advertised pricing, and Apple and Bose and some other companies that have really strong brands have gotten pretty good at this, and the way that they do it is their minimum advertised price, it's not that much higher than what they're actually selling it to the retailer for, or to the distributor for, right, to the channel partner. And then what happens then is they have some incentives on the back end that say, if you meet these incentives, then we'll give you some kind of off invoice or rebates type of incentives, as long as you kind of play by our rules. And you got to be really careful about this, and it varies by geographic region, as does almost all of this stuff, and country, and even states, in the US sometimes have different laws about this. And especially in a digital commerce environment, the idea of a minimum advertised price is usually what it's selling at anyway. When you're talking about a brick and mortar store, you can say you can't advertise in a circular or in a TV ad or whatever lower than this price, but you can sell it for whatever you want. But when you're in a digital commerce setting, generally those are going to be the same thing, right? It's not like you're advertising one price, then you go to the site and it's another price. That wouldn't make much sense. So it's starting to change a little bit, and I think the need for these omni-channel pricing strategy and tactics and tools are becoming increasing as the nature of commerce changes and shifts more towards digital.
No, I totally agree. Especially with vertical price fixing, I think there's a huge amount of gray zone with this stuff and what's allowed and what's not. And as you said, it varies by jurisdiction. So a lot of care is needed. And maybe we should point out that neither of us is lawyers, so don't rely on anything we say.
Good idea. In general, or just on this topic, would you say?
I'll leave that up to the audience to figure out that one. That's
good. Yeah. Good point. We're just talking here. We're just talking. Our opinions are our own, right? And like you said, even if we were lawyers, our knowledge would only be specific to whatever region that we have, past the bar, and we know the laws around. And in the U.S., there's the Robinson-Patman Act and the Sherman Act that are kind of the bedrock for a lot of these concepts. But there's different laws in Europe. There's different laws by country. They have some like very specific laws in France, for example, and other parts of the world around this kind of stuff. Right?
And we'll cover one of those in a little bit. Actually, that's one. Coming up.
Cool. So we also the second area that we talked about beyond the price fixing one is around anti-competitive pricing, right? So that's really where you've got the company that's kind of limiting buyer choice, right? And so they're strategically limiting the buyer's choices, and oftentimes it's with lower prices so they can kind of make out and establish themselves as the clear market leader and get people used to buying things and then change the market dynamics in some way, right? So there's this example where Norwegian Air shuttle started flying from London to Oakland, right? And they undercut the British Airways prices to San Francisco.
There was no. Yeah, they undercut San Francisco and opened up Oakland.
Right.
There was no price Oakland involved.
Right.
Yeah.
But Oakland and San Francisco, for those that don't live in the Bay Area, are 15, 20 minutes apart from each other. So really, it's pretty much the same route. And so they
at 3 in the morning they are.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. But it depends on where you're going. Not everyone's going to San Francisco. So depending on where you're going in the Bay Area, it's a viable alternative, right? Let's put it that way, to use our previous terminology, right? And what it did was, by offering this really low price route, and drastically undercutting the pricing for for London to San Francisco, they shifted a lot of the volume over to them, and then BA then started. They kind of responded to it, right? So
they didn't. I don't think they even waited for Norwegian to launch. I think they announced, British Airways announced they were going to fly the same route even before Norwegian started, and they matched them on fares. And they have some pretty crazy fares here, right? £1,000 for a business class seat to San Francisco from London is insane, right? It's insanely great.
Actually.
Yeah. So clearly they were trying to make the route. I mean, British Airways wasn't making any money on that. They were trying to make it uneconomic for Norwegian. Really clear.
Yeah. And then once Norwegian then said, okay, well then if we can't make any money in this, we're not going to do it. Then what happened?
Then BA pulled out. So now Oakland has no service. So this is all. What's interesting here is you get these short-term win for the consumer, but it's a ephemeral thing because they're basically just trying to do it to drive them out of the market.
Yeah.
Right? So now this,
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, and this is kind of a bit predatory, right? And governments often prohibit predatory pricing, but it's hard to, actually identify or define what that is, right? And so, but having a dominant market position, gives the company the power and the visibility, and more risk, for kind of being labeled as predatory when you're in the dominant market position, but that itself can be a pretty difficult concept or a difficult thing to identify, to clearly define, right? And so selling below cost is obviously a bit of a red flag, and like we said, in France, it's actually illegal, right? But for higher gross margin businesses like airlines, there isn't, much of a restriction. The variable cost of an airline seat is, usually $40 or $50 when we're talking about fuel so there isn't really much of a restriction there. So
No,
people can play games.
I think in areas where, so the whole area of predatory pricing is clearly, there's an illegal core to this thing, but the range that is unethical is bigger than the range that it is legal. So, I mean, my main advice would be don't be a jerk and don't be a bully.
Yeah.
Easy to say, perhaps, and there's a lot of money at stake, then people are going to willfully ignore that.
Mm-hmm.
Another area where you can have anti-competitive behavior, and this one was a surprise to me when I first came across it a few years ago, is with rebates. So if you're the dominant player in a market, you have the potential to use rebates to lock in customers. So one way to do this is if you've got a monopoly product, you've got a product that's really desired, and then you bundle it in with something else, which is more ho-hum, which is much more competitive, right? Then basically you're saying you have to buy the second product if you're going to buy the first one.
Mm-hmm.
Second one, where it might be where a large player has a large rebate that can have the effect of locking in the volume. So if you buy 90 pencils and you get you buy 100 pencils and you've bought 9. If you get a great price on buying 90 and the last 10 are free because they're included in the rebate, you basically locked out the last guy from buying those, from selling his last 10 pencils.
Yeah. But obviously, I mean, rebates are generally a best practice in pricing because it allows you to pay for performance, and it allows you to make sure that companies aren't taking advantage, like of the suppliers and committing to these high volumes and getting better contractual pricing on invoice and then not fulfilling their commitments, right? So it's a balancing act, and
yes, and it's I think the moral is the more dominant you are, and dominant is a legal term that needs to be described because lawyers will spend lots of time arguing about how big the market is and are you dominant in it or not. Mm-hmm. It's one piece, and then the second red flag is if you have rebates that have big step thresholds. So if you have a rebate that's sort of relatively small and progresses slowly, then you're generally okay. If you have big steps, so buy 70% of your target and we'll give you a 30% rebate, that's the stuff where it's starting to become a bigger risk of being considered illegal.
Right. And it's also how you structure rebates. So when I was at Cisco, we had a series of rebate programs for different different incentive programs, and one of them was called the Value Incentive Program, and the point of it was to encourage companies to invest in certain advanced technologies that we were bringing to market, emerging technologies especially. And so, by investing and getting people trained and certified and specialized in these areas, they would get additional off-invoice rebates, incentives, right? And so what would happen though is it was supposed to be designed in a way that those incentives were not going to impact the street price of our products, but when so it was creating a bit of an anti-competitive environment to a degree, because what we heard from our smaller resellers was, hey, they are actually using these incentives because their prices that they're offering have to account for the fact that they're going to get this incentive, even if it's not tied to this sale, right? So it can be a very, you have to really think through the entire, process here and the go-to-market and the implications of some of these decisions on how, your channel partners are competing and how your customers are benefiting or not, right? So,
and you need to talk to the lawyers. For those on the webcast, is that the word? Webcast.
Yeah.
There was a judgment recently that said doing some things that maybe sounded like they were illegal, but they're in Europe, but they're not illegal because they didn't have the detrimental effect that would have said that they weren't detrimental to competition. So,
right.
Good luck with that one, right? That's it's very complicated.
Yep. So let's move on to the third area, and that's around monopoly pricing. And obviously, this is a big one that's wide open for jerkiness or bullying, right? So basically, anytime a company has an effective monopoly, we kind of alluded to this when we were talking about the cartel and acting as a monopoly. But obviously, anytime you control, a majority of the market, you have a lot of pricing power, right? Now, value pricing, tells us, as pricing professionals that we want to take advantage of pricing power where we have it. But obviously, you need to understand where that line is of going into unethical and illegal behavior, right?
Yeah, and we talk, and this touches on a topic we talked about last time, which is that I think the issue is, does the buyer have a reasonable alternative they can choose? Um, we might complain about the price of the latest iPhone, but it's where Apple has a monopoly on iPhones, but it's not. It's hard to argue that anyone needs the latest iPhone.
Right.
So that
There's viable alternatives out there with tons of different Android phones at lower price points that are just as capable. Now there is the argument that the ecosystem lock, right, is kind of the argument that's made
and
there
that's
sometimes, but that's
and
that's
that's
open
different.
for debate. Yeah,
And that's I'd argue that's not so much. Then we're in a different space of anti-competitive behavior than pricing. So,
indeed,
but
right,
yeah. But
definitely. So yeah, let's bring. So there's when we get into the medicine and we get into that area, that's where things can get different, right? And that's where you can really see this more starkly in a lot of cases. So let's get into some of those examples. I know you have a background in this industry. So yeah, this is an interesting article that came out fairly recently where so basically there was a 97,000% increase in the pricing of this AP Acthar gel, right, which is used to treat multiple sclerosis and arthritis. So this was a product that was Questor Pharmaceuticals at the time, which was later bought by Mallinckrodt. And basically what happened here is they took the pricing from $40 a vial to almost $39,000 a vial in less than 2 decades. And not only that, obviously set off some alarm bells, but whistleblowers actually came forward and showed evidence of, bribes and kickbacks to doctors to prescribe the medicine as the costs skyrocket. This case was settled at the end of last year, and they did agree to pay fines of over $15 million. But I thought it was interesting that the whistleblowers actually received about a fifth of that, so they received about $3 million for bringing it to light. What do you think about that?
I think you need to do something to make these things come forward, right? We can get into an indictment of the legal system, but let's not go there. There needs to be some kind of incentive. But having said that, of course, I think a $50 million fine is kind of peanuts in this case.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if you look at what the numbers are here, 15 million is about 400 vials at 39,000 a vial, and they're bringing in over $1 billion a year on this, on the Acthar gel. So that's 1.5% of annual sales is hardly much of a penalty, really. It's a bit of a slap on the wrist, really.
It seems like, although it is interesting, maybe there's karma in effect here. I don't know if that's a pricing thing, but Mallinckrodt is the company that now owns that drug is caught up in the opioids scandal. So their stock price, they got all sorts of lawsuits against them. So maybe that's a case where the karma is going to get them all. I don't think it's pricing that got them at the end of the day.
That's right. But just bad business practices, unethical behavior in general, and yeah.
Which is this part of the challenge with the medical market altogether is just so much money sloshing around in it that there's a lot of people are attracted to that, and they have some incentives to do bad things.
Right, and I mean that's maybe a topic for a larger discussion, but there certainly are perverse incentives in a lot of different areas of the of life sciences and pharma and medicine in general, and it's challenging because it directly pits a lot of times the common good of the people versus the profits of corporations, and so it's a very stark contrast when you start talking about these areas.
That's right. Well, and I mean, more generally, I think this is also a case where there's big differences in the rules between different jurisdictions. So the EU is very aggressive on anti-competitive practices, not just pricing. Fines can go up to 10% of global revenues. So it's none of this 15 million on a billion type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Those on the webcast again. It's Google was fined 5 billion in 2018, and another 2.7 in 2017, and Intel 1.5 in 2009, and Qualcomm 1.2 in 2018. So the EU really takes a dim view of anti-competitive practices of all kinds.
Yeah, they're probably the most aggressive about both the definition of anti-competitive as well as the penalties, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think the Wikipedia page on this is really super interesting. Again, you can see that in the notes, and these fines are enormous. So you need to
and
be very careful on this.
Yeah, so they're certainly more lax about this in the U.S. A bit more laissez-faire, if you pardon the use of a French term in discussing U.S. Regulation. But I think, yeah, I mean, we are even seeing some governments and even local governments start to act in some cases. And so, yeah, this insulin pricing one is, I think, an interesting case. A lot of the rationale behind pricing of U.S. Pharmaceuticals, which are generally much higher than other places in the world, have to do with innovation, and there's good reason for that, and that's its whole own topic, right? And we can get into a bit of it here, but probably not cover it effectively. But insulin is a bit of it seems like they're being maybe a bit abusive of the regulation and of those definitions here, right? So just to give a little bit of a history around this topic, right? Insulin was discovered in 1923 by this guy named Frederick Banting. He actually didn't put his name on the patent. He had ethical issues with profiting from a drug that would save lives. So he actually sold the patent to the University of Toronto for $1, which in '72 sold to Consult Labs, so they sold that lab to the Canada Development Corporation, which then sold it to a company called Sanofi, which is a pharmaceutical company, right? So insulin is generally a biological product. So getting a biosimilar to the market is almost as costly as a new drug, but it's murkier about the patent infringement and the laws there. So, but basically, what's happened over the last 90 years or so is that three companies really have become the leaders here, controlling over 90% of the market, and they have a lot of pricing power as a result, and they haven't been afraid to use it.
No, they haven't, right? And so they haven't just been abusing the fact that they have a oligopoly, a triopoly.
Mm-hmm.
So they have been innovating. They have slower and faster versions. They do things on the production as well. So they've been a boon. I think some of these innovations have been a real boon for type 1 diabetes patients, who has really helped them. But they've also increased the prices on the basic version, and that's used by people with type 2 diabetes, which is a growing group. So it seems to put the lie on the story that they would have you believe that it's all about innovation. Some of it is, it's very clear, a lot of it is about using their monopoly power.
Yeah, and I mean, then especially in the way that they incentivize and kind of encourage the doctors to always be prescribing the latest version, when the older version would have worked just fine. That would have been a lot cheaper for people. And it's getting to the point now that people are really, they can't afford insulin in some cases, which is keeping them alive, right? And so it's starting to get to the point where like we said, that some of the local governments are starting to act. So Colorado recently put a cap on insulin pricing, and the Attorney General of Kentucky sued some of these companies. So it's a people are taking note and people are acting. It would be nice, if there was more done at the federal level on this stuff, I would say.
Yeah, and I don't want to be the smug European, but this is this kind of oligopoly can exploit the mess that is the U.S. healthcare system. The regulators are trying these band-aids like price controls that squeeze the bubble in one place, but oftentimes that just means it pops out in another, and then all the market participants are pointing fingers at each other while walking away to the bank and being quite happy about it. When the fundamental problem is a broken market with end consumers who have no reasonable next best alternative. So it can be an unholy mess. More often than not, the fix is just move the pain around. So in the cases in Colorado and Kentucky, it sounds like what will happen is the cost will pass on to the insurance companies. So it will increase everyone's cost, but decrease the patient's cost. And then you get, and then you get, it's sort of leading into our next topic, I think, but you get the case where you have prices of drugs that are, it's the same drug, but it's different depending on the indication it's used for. So
Yeah.
this is an interesting
Yeah,
topic
this is
for
an
me.
interesting one because as pricing professionals, we always talk about segmentation, right? And there are indeed some differences in the actual amount of the drug that is administered on a daily basis by these patches, right, or the implants. And so, I think that's the rationale that's being used, but it's such a huge difference in the pricing, 8 times more. And what doctors are saying is like the difference in the amount that's actually administered is not, it's not even really that much of a factor, right? But then you get like the insurance companies that are refusing to pay for the cheaper version for a child because that's not what they've approved, right? So it really feels quite manipulative, right? I think.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And a medical market. I mean, there's so many examples in the medical markets just because it's difficult to manage a market with price signals whenever you have a monopoly, and there's no viable next best alternative, which is the case for innovative drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition, you've got the complexity of the buying process where you need experts, right? You and I go in and we need our doctors to help us. And then the doctors have a set of incentives, and the insurance companies have a set of incentives, and the hospitals have a set of incentives, and the drug companies have a set of incentives. It creates a mess.
Right, and so where you have competing incentives, that's where and you have as I called them before, some perverse incentives that are out there where things aren't aligned. That's where I think this needs to be addressed through legislation and the alignment of those incentives, and so and or the alignment of those incentives. So it can be done like companies like I think Kaiser Permanente, for example, does a good job at aligning, on the insurance side with the doctors and actually putting forward patient health as a KPI, right? But there's as you mentioned, there's so many parties involved that have these different competing incentives, and unfortunately, a lot of times, the people that have the least voice are the actual patients that need this stuff. In this case that we're talking about, it's a hormone blocker, so it's not life or death. And so probably there's not going to be as much public outrage as there is over something like an EpiPen or the insulin. But it is at the same time a good example where there's um, obviously competing incentives, and there's some rationale that's being used that probably isn't really aligned with the public good.
Yeah, no, that's right. So let's move away from healthcare. I mean, I do think this is a topic ripe to come back to. And let's going down the list now. So the next one on our list was ethical challenges of pricing was price discrimination, which we sort of just touched on, right? This is selling the same product or service to different people at different prices.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and as we mentioned, it very much touches on value pricing, and you could even say that one person's price discrimination would be another person's value pricing, right? So you can use these, and it almost depends on your perspective there, but certainly an interesting topic to explore.
No, that's right. And so price, this is the thing with price discrimination. This is where it is technically illegal in Europe, is price discrimination, interestingly enough, although they recently said it's not abusive per se. So you need to be careful. So it's tricky, right? So maybe an example, what is price discrimination? So I think we're all familiar with airline pricing, where the person sat next to you may have paid half as much or twice as much as you did. And that's legal because, in fact, the offer is a little different. If it's really cheap, then you probably bought it well ahead, or there was a sale on, or you bought more restrictions, or you didn't get luggage, or you didn't get food, or whatever it is. So we're all used to that, and we all seem to accept that that's fine, because it's sort of a different bundle, right? But it is clearly price discrimination. It's just ethical price discrimination because it's based on value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think as long as, I mean, obviously there can be some grumbling but where you have alternatives and where it's rational, right, and there is some additional value being provided, that's where, even though it can feel a bit predatory when they're charging for certain things, and especially the amount I think that's being charged as compared to the ticket is an important factor in this to consider here.
Where they
But
have alternatives, right?
yeah,
It's
but if
about
you have
all about
alternatives, it's okay. Where you don't have alternatives, you start getting into price gouging, and like for example, when there's a hurricane, in Florida or in New Orleans, and you start to see some of the headlines that come out and the pricing practices that are coming out there. Then the governments, have a clear mandate to step in and find these companies. So yeah, I think you have some examples here that you're going to discuss.
Yeah, well, it was so Delta, Delta Airlines algorithms are built so that when demand goes up, the fare goes up, and of course, a hurricane is a great way of increasing demand. So then a lot of people got upset. So that's and now they caught this and they figured it out, and then they basically said, okay, fine, we'll put a cap on it, and we'll fix it. So that's one example where I think it worked. I guess Uber and Lyft are close to your heart, right?
Yeah, being from the Bay Area, but also traveling a lot and not being able to cycle all the time. But those are some good examples. So surge pricing on New Year's Eve. I think people are generally accepting of that, and there are generally alternatives there. You can take a taxi, you can take public transport in some cases, but when it's an emergency, and you let these algorithms, that if they don't have any of these kind of common sense caps on them, they can really get pretty crazy, right? So in the fast moving situations, it can get pretty crazy. Even in, there's been plenty of examples where Uber's charged ridiculous amounts of money. I'd written one in the Pricing Horror Stories article last year about where they charged, I think, around $14,000 for someone for, I don't know, it was a fairly short ride, less than 10 miles, I think. And at first they refused to actually, pay him back for it. So, but eventually they did. So they're kind of learning as they go. But, you got to keep things in a common sense zone. The other thing that's interesting with Uber and Lyft is that, with this new gig economy law that they've passed in California, that the way that they set pricing is making it a bit harder for them to argue that they're not an employer, because whereas originally it was more of a marketplace, supply demand, and then I'm just taking a percentage cut of it. Now with the increased complexity of the way that they offer ride shares and the different options, they're not actually doing that all the time. So what they're doing is dissociating the price that's being paid from the consumer to the price that they're paying the drivers. And by doing that, they're acting as an employer, right? It's a lot harder to argue that you're just a marketplace that's facilitating a transaction between two other parties when you're doing that. So what they're now experimenting with some things like letting the driver set their pricing as a way of trying to counteract some of those arguments. We'll see kind of where that goes, but that's all new stuff as of the beginning of this year. That's just starting to play out, really.
Yeah, and I mean, two-sided markets are very interesting from a pricing perspective, because and I don't think we have time to get into that now, but it's super interesting.
Yeah, it could be a good topic for a follow-up, another episode on that, maybe.
What I always find slightly interesting, but one thing that I'm struck by is there are a set of economists who basically say that price gouging isn't a thing because you're basically letting the market work. So this particular website that's up here basically says don't worry about price gouging because it's just the market working.
Yeah.
I think that's fine in a steady state situation. I think when you have a shock to the system and there's no time for the market to work, i.e. a hurricane rattles through, then why should the person who just happens to luckily have the resources in big demand get to make wild profits out of it when in fact the market isn't going to respond because it can't,
Right. And it obviously, I mean, there's a number of things to consider in that, right? And
well, you've got to have a bit of humanity in this, right? So yes, the market might work well, but then anyone who can't afford water doesn't get any water, and that
right.
I'm not.
Right. So they would make the case that, well, having $100 case of water is better than not having water there on the shelves when you need it. But if you don't have $100 for a case of water because you don't make enough money to even have $100, then what are you going to do? And so, that's where you don't have a viable alternative, and that's where it becomes a problem, right? And that's kind of coming back to what we were talking about before around, both viable alternatives and taking advantage of certain groups of people. I don't think you can use market economics as an excuse for doing people harm in order to profit, and especially when you're talking about necessities like, food and water, right?
You're getting into the fact that certain people's lives are worth more than others if you take that to its logical extreme. And I agree with that sentiment, but I don't want to see it play out in an emergency quite as ruthlessly as it would be
Yeah,
the case.
and psychology is a key thing to consider here. There needs to be some reasoning behind it, and that's kind of the along the lines of where the economists are going in that. I mean, it does make some sense, right? And so, but there's a limit to that, and so, I think there's different types of discrimination. We talked about kind of the emergency where it shed some light on some of the needs, but there's there's other types of price discrimination that aren't necessarily based on time, right? So, sometimes it's fine, and other times, it can be more discriminatory and kind of illegal. So,
There's clearly an area of price discrimination where it's unethical and illegal. And if you're talking about racial discrimination or economic discrimination and insurance redlining, right? Those are really clear. I do think, though, that and different jurisdictions have different thresholds on this. So, the US is very sensitive about age discrimination. Europe doesn't really care.
generally, I think we're both for letting free markets function until they stop working for most people, especially when the wealthy are benefiting at the expense of the majority of people. And so, unfortunately, there are a lot of cases of that happening right now, and there's various means to try to do something about it. So, rent control is one of the older mechanisms for putting a cap on the amount that landlords can increase rents to allow working class people to live in their homes and not be driven out of certain places. That's very near and dear in the Bay Area. We have rent control in San Francisco and some other areas within the Bay Area, but not other areas. But yeah, what you're seeing now, especially with foreign investment, and really the impact of that on the housing prices and really driving the median housing price well above what the median income levels are and what people can afford. You're seeing the governments start to try to do something about that, right? So yeah, like you have for those on the webcast, we have this example up from Vancouver, which is one of the most stark examples where the real estate market really started just blowing up around when the Olympics were there, and it's continued to do so. And what you had is a lot of foreign investors coming in and buying places and actually not even living in them or renting them, and just buying them as an investment, as speculation, right? And so what they started doing is putting a tax on those types of properties of 15%, which had some immediate impact on it. But now they're actually, I think they're going to increase it, or they might have already increased it to see, because it continues to be an issue. So they're trying to do something about it. It's not necessarily having, the impact that they were hoping it would. So they're trying to kind of ratchet it up and see if they can do something about it. And I mean, this is one that kind of comes back to mission-driven pricing, right? So the government's mission here is to have affordable housing for people that are living in and working in Vancouver, to have a decent quality of life. And I think they're fine doing that at the expense of foreign speculative real estate investors, right? But it's not easy, as we can see, because it can have unintended consequences, or it might not have the impact that you're thinking. So it's an interesting topic of conversation, I would say.
Well, yeah, I think regulating prices is really tricky. It's pretty clear that rent control suppresses building of apartments, which makes the problem worse in the long run, and then you get a more lottery. So I do tend to think the taxing approach is less problematic than price setting, but none of it's easy. And of course, the ethical niceties tend to be overridden when it's self-interest, right? If I'm sitting on one of those apartments in Vancouver and the prices have stopped going up 10% a year, then I'm a little less happy about it than I was, and I don't really mind who buys it. So
yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily agree that rent control itself would discourage real estate building. There's a lot of other factors, like in California, for example, that are more of a factor in that, because the rent control generally only applies to people that have moved in. So you can build a new apartment and charge whatever you want at market. It's just once those people move in, you can't continue to ratchet up their rent if it's going crazy. But more of the issue in California that we're facing is the laws around the density of housing and some of the environmental concerns, and the fact that there's a lot of other regulations around it that are causing these some of these issues. But foreign real estate investment is definitely an issue, and there's a ton of money coming into the market that's driven it up, well beyond where it would be without it. So yeah, there's a number of factors to consider. But let's move on. I think we had the last area of unethical pricing was disinformation. So what are your thoughts around that?
Well, I think there's a real spectrum here of jerkiness, our word of the day. At one end is out and out lying and not informing about required fees, down to just annoying things like a bit of a bait and switch. So maybe showing a lower price, but then that model's not available or it really doesn't work. So you get different practices here.
Yeah, some areas are particularly prone to this and attract regulators. So, credit card fees is one that you've heard a lot about, and have legislators stepped in and started to do something about. The hotel resort fees, right? For those following on the webcast, we have this story about hotel amenity fees, and this is really one that's pretty near and dear, since I do travel quite a lot. I probably stay in a couple hundred hotel nights a year, and you see this happening. So if you go to hotels.com, for example, and you do a search, when you apply the search criteria and you look at the list of results, then it presents one perspective, right? And it actually doesn't include these resort fees. And then when you go to purchase it, then it adds these in. And you have this example up here for the Bellagio in Las Vegas. Sorry, Bellagio, to call you out like this, but this is pretty.
But yeah, I mean, in this case, right? When you search, the price that shows up is the 609,
right?
And then they stick $100 of resort fee, and then of course one thing you Americans like to do is have taxes be separate, and then it has the famous word fees, which is always an interesting one as well, right?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, what are those?
In fact, the price of this hotel is 30% higher than the headline number that they stick on the page before.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's pretty unethical, and yeah, and obviously there's differences in in what can be done and the way that things are presented between the U.S. and Europe, right?
Yeah, and it's somewhat mitigated because everyone knows in the U.S. that tax is not included, so you add it on top. But it's clearly a way of using a lower number.
Yeah, and even the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has said that they harm consumers. So hopefully they're going to step in and
Yeah, well, we'll see, right? I mean, to me, this it may not be illegal, but it's unethical, especially this resort fee type stuff.
Right.
Just unbundling fees when they can't be avoided how is that in anyone's interest?
Right.
Yeah, and as you know, taxes in Europe, VAT is included in the price, since you can't avoid it; you have to pay it, right? So, but I mean, I'm not going to die on my sword on this stuff, but to me, it is a bit. This is a case where it would make more sense if fees that are really required are included, and that would include sales tax.
But, yeah. What about tips?
Well, that's another one, right? So, yeah, tips in the U.S. are what's the expected number, like 20-odd%?
Well, 15 to 20 is kind of the general range. Yeah.
So but I mean, in Europe, it's in Switzerland, you don't need to tip much at all, and never over 10, I would argue.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, for us, it's not really an issue because it's just everyone knows about it, right? And you just expect it. But when you come from another place that you're not expecting it, then it can really kind of take you by surprise and maybe cause you to make some decisions you wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that's when it becomes a bit unethical. I also, when you add all this stuff up, like you said, it can be 30+%. And in San Francisco, not only do they have the tax and then the tip, then they have this this health mandate thing that's another 5%. So it's, you know, adding up to almost 30+%, you know, a third of the bill almost. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
and then you see some practices like places where they have a lot of foreign tourists, like in Miami, that gets a ton of European tourists, where they actually just they present the price on the menu that says, you know, $10 for this, and then they not only put the tax onto it afterwards, which we've been talking about, but they put the tip onto it, and they present it, you know, when they give you the bill, it actually includes both the tax and the tip, but on the menu, it didn't include either of those things. So I can see how, if you weren't expecting this, it would certainly come as quite a surprise. I mean, they're doing it because if they don't do that, then the people don't tip, and then, you know, and unfortunately, what happens is the people working at the restaurant depend on those tips because the restaurants are allowed to pay them below, you know, minimum wage, right? So they really rely on that. So but it's you know, it's something that I agree. There should be more transparency around it, and people should, you know, be more upfront. And if you can't, like you said, a fee's fine if it adds some value, and if you have a choice of paying it or not, depending on that. You know, it's one thing they do in Europe, actually, in Italy, right? They famously like put the water bottle and put the bread on the table in Italy and Portugal and things like that. And that's one thing that American tourists sometimes think, oh, it's just part of it's included. And then you get, afterwards, you get, you know, here's the $3 for your water and here's the $2 for your bread.
Yeah.
And that takes us by surprise a little bit. So, yeah.
Yeah, but well, it's normally that's a few euro, but yes, that is the same, moving in the same direction, but it's a small euro.
Yeah.
Small charge. Sometimes it can get really silly. I mean, for those on the web, and I think this is our last one, but one of my favorite pricing comedy songs, if you will, who knew you had one of those, is Fascinating Aida, where it's called Flights for 50p. And the idea is that they're flying to Ireland, and it's clearly on Ryanair. And then the fees just keep coming and coming and coming, and they basically hate the experience by the end of it. And it can go the side, you know, there is a downside to your brand if customers feel like they're being nickeled and dimed all the time.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
that's a funny one. Yeah, you sent me that before, and I chuckled about it. And it'd be cool to do something about pricing humor if there's enough. If we could cover enough of interesting things, it might be an interesting episode at some point.
And if we're funny enough, I'm not sure we can debate that topic.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's probably about time to wrap up. I mean, I hope for the folks that are listening, this has been useful. For people that want to learn more about pricing and particularly what not to do. We try to present the different topics that you would need to avoid. You know, the continuum as we're showing here, but also the different areas that are clearly illegal and unethical. So I'd like to, you know, thank you, Ian, for joining me again. And I don't know if there's anything you'd like to say in conclusion here.
Well, yeah, just the one thing that I took away from exploring the dark side is this realization that as we get more sophisticated about how we think about pricing, the more we need to think about the implications that it can have. If you've got dynamic pricing and you're doing lots of price segmentation and value pricing, it's very easy to have some effects where you're basically doing unethical pricing. I think rideshare companies and airlines have some of the most sophisticated pricing and sometimes get in a world of hurt because of it.
Right. Because it's hard, because especially when you start doing, you know, using AI and algorithms to price, and if you're letting those operate without a lot of oversight, then depending, you know, and they're unconstrained, then they can start making bad decisions. And it's only after the fact that you say, oh, well, that didn't make any sense, but I didn't know that I had to tell it to stay within this zone, or, you know, or it didn't know about the fact that there's a hurricane going on. It just knew that all these people are trying to book flights out of Miami that day, right? So, you know, there is an element of common sense. There's a whole other topic around AI specifically and how you have to be careful, especially when you're doing segmentation and optimization around pricing, but also other areas where if you're not careful, you can end up doing things like institutionalizing discrimination or racism that's been practiced in the past because that's what's in the data, so it has that bias. Anyway, so, you know, I've enjoyed the time as always.
Great. Well, no, great talking about this, and thanks, Gabe.
All right.
Enjoyed
Thank
it.
you. All right. Me too. Cheers.
Bye.